All right, so where we left off yesterday, the United States is in this bitter debate over slavery, and the lines are becoming drawn between the North and the South. Generally speaking, as we acquire more territory and the United States heads towards the Pacific, by the end of the Mexican-American War, the United States will acquire everything all the way out to California in what is today the continental United States. The 48 continental states will be acquired by the United States by the end of the Mexican-American War. And the question is, everything west of the Mississippi River, what do we do with it? That is the debate that continues after the Mexican-American War. We've acquired Texas, Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, California. We acquired what is today Washington, Idaho, and Oregon from the British. We've now bought or annexed all of this territory. And what do we do with it? The debate over this, whether or not the United States should do this, led to the Free Soil movement, and this movement created the construction of a new political party, the Republican Party. And so by the time we get to the American Civil War, this is the role that we find ourselves in. What do we do with these territories? The next event, this last discussion we want to have, is the intense final events from during that Industrial Revolution, that antebellum period that we talked about last chapter. These final events are going to lead us down the path towards war. And by the end of these last few discussions we want to have today, the only solution for many Southerners is secession from the United States and war. So, once again, each time one of these territories applies for statehood, the question becomes, what do we do with them? Are they slave or are they free? Which brings us to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. After the Mexican-American War was over, Kansas was applying for statehood. And the problem was that slavery existed in Kansas, but it was also north of the 3630 line. And so if the United States continued with the Missouri Compromise in the 3630 line, then that was going to cause a problem if Kansas entered the United States as a slave state. Also, if Kansas enters as a slave state, there's no other state paired with them. Well, what do we do with Senate if there's more slave states than free states in the United States? So the solution that was offered up at the time seemed like a very reasonable solution. In fact, what's more American in a democratic society than to simply let people vote? And so therefore, the answer to this problem was the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Moving forward, we are going to get rid of the Missouri Compromise, and when a state applies for statehood, simply let them vote on whether or not that territory wants to include slavery or not. Now, the reason why they thought they could get away with this at the time is because it was anticipated that when Kansas entered for statehood, the territory north of Kansas, Nebraska, was also going to apply for statehood at the same time. And everybody assumed that when Kansas enters as a slave state, Nebraska is going to enter as a free state. They would cancel each other out. The situation would still maintain the same status quo in the Senate. Everybody would be happy. This seemed like a much more American solution to our problem, and so the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. Here's the problem. What they didn't anticipate was when they passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, thousands of pro-slavery and thousands of pro-abolition supporters moved to Kansas with the specific intention of manipulating this vote over slavery. And when it happened, a fight broke out in the state of Kansas that the result is we call Bleeding Kansas. The people of this territory literally went to war with one another over the vote of whether or not the state of Kansas should be entered as a slave state or a free state. In the end, the state of Kansas did enter the United States as a slave state, but the fighting that took place over this ripped the state apart. And the most famous event that took place during this bleeding Kansas was an event we call the Potawatomi Massacre. And this event basically confirmed the fears of most Southerners. If you remember last chapter when we talked about that antebellum period, we talked about how Southerners felt that Northerners were un-American with their new ideas. These abolition movements were just a quintessential demonstration of all of the other things that they saw happening in the North. And the Southerners felt like the people of the North were outright aggressive towards them. Well, at the Potawatomi Massacre, a famous abolitionist, John Brown, and his followers actually attacked a group of slavery supporters in their home in the middle of the night while they were sleeping, mutilated their bodies, and hung them out in the front yard as a sign to anybody else who supported slavery of what would happen to them moving forward. And so the battle that takes place over bleeding Kansas between John Brown and the abolitionists demonstrates the extent to what some of those radical groups of abolitionists, how far they were willing to go. And these events demonstrated to the rest of the country that this fight over slavery, as the United States continues to spread out west, is going to only intensify. On top of that, not long after the bleeding Kansas incident, a slave, Dred Scott, who had moved to Northern Free Territory with his owner, sued for his freedom. And this was the first time that the United States Supreme Court was going to be asked to make a ruling directly on the issue of slavery. Now, if you remember correctly, when we talked about this all the way back at the constitutional era, the job of the United States government, the way that it is created, the legislative branch creates laws, the executive branch carries them out, and the Supreme Court, the judicial branch, their job is to interpret them. Up until this point, the judicial branch had never been asked to directly create a ruling on the issue of slavery. So here's what happened. Dred Scott moved with his owner to a free territory. His owner was a wealthy physician. They moved from the southern territories up to, I believe they were living in Wisconsin at the time. When his owner died, Dred Scott assumed that he was going to be a free man. He was living in a free territory. His owner was no longer living, so he assumed he was free. Unfortunately, in his owner's will, the owner willed him to his widow. So Dred Scott, at the behest of abolitionists, sued for his freedom. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And in the Supreme Court ruling, it was the first time the United States Supreme Court was asked to make a decision directly on the issue of slavery. And in that case, the Supreme Court ruled against Dred Scott. They ruled that since Dred Scott was not a U.S. citizen, that the United States Constitution does not apply to him. Even though Dred Scott had been born in the United States territories, even though he'd lived his entire life in the United States, at the time he was not considered a citizen. So all of the rights that are granted to American citizens did not apply to him. He was considered property, and under the Fifth Amendment to the United States, people are guaranteed their right of property, and therefore he had to remain a slave. Abolitionists were horrified at the Dred Scott decision. Southerners applauded it. This was a victory for them. The Constitution, the Supreme Court had ruled in their favor. Slavery was considered constitutional in their opinion. And this event further divides the country. Then, a Southerner's worst nightmare took place. In the 1850s, after the Compromise of 1850, they created the fugitive slave laws that enabled the United States government, enabled people to track down slaves even after they had returned to free territory and drag them back down to the South, creating all sorts of social upheaval. An abolitionist named, once again, John Brown reemerges. The same John Brown who had committed the Potawatomi Massacre in bleeding Kansas, who had mutilated slave owners and left their bodies as messages to anybody else who supported slavery. This time, John Brown, his intention was to raid the United States garrison at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, steal guns, arm local slaves to create his own army of slaves, and then lead a bloody rebellion through the South, violently freeing the slaves. As a result of the Dred Scott decision, John Brown felt that if the United States Constitution and the Supreme Court wasn't going to free slaves, well then he was going to take matters into his own hand, create his own army of slaves, and lead a bloody rebellion. This is the worst nightmare of any Southerner. All the way back to the colonial period, Southerners who owned slaves, their worst fears of all was a bloody rebellion, even though it wasn't very realistic. Rebellions almost never took place in the South. And slaves, we talked about last chapter, were far more likely to rebel by doing jobs improperly or appearing ignorant more than they were ever going to actually run away or rebel from their masters. But nonetheless, John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry proved that abolitionists were willing to go so far as to arm slaves and encourage them to kill their masters. In the end, John Brown's raid did not go anywhere. It resulted in a showdown between him and the government where he was captured, ironically, by Robert E. Lee and later hanged for treason. But once again, as we are making our way closer to the Civil War, the situation is becoming more intense. John Brown is viewed as an evil villain by Southerners and a martyr for abolitionists in the North. Abolitionists applaud his willingness to die for the cause, and Southerners view him as a villain. And even though he was hanged for treason for his actions, we still see the United States making its way even more divided as we draw closer to 1860. Which brings us to the final straw, the election of 1860. This is the first time that the Republican Party has a legitimate contender for the presidency of the United States. The first Republican to be offered up as a legitimate presidential candidate is the man from out in Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. Now, most people anticipated that Lincoln's major competition for the presidency that year was going to be another Illinois resident, the senator from Illinois who had just beat Abraham Lincoln for his Senate seat 2 years prior, Stephen Douglas. However, when we talk about this, remember, the Democratic Party was weaker as a result of that free soil movement after the Mexican-American War. And so the Democratic Party was split between Stephen Douglas in the North and a Southerner, John Breckinridge, in the South. Now, if you remember from a couple chapters back when we talked about Andrew Jackson, I told you at that election of 1824, one of the biggest problems that the United States has with our election system is any time that you see a candidate, more than two candidates for president, that creates a very dangerous presidential election. Generally speaking, if we only have two major candidates, the Electoral College runs rather smoothly. But when you have more than two candidates, this creates a problem. And in the election of 1860, this created a problem. You see, Stephen Douglas and John Breckinridge split the Democratic Party in the North. And John Breckinridge and Stephen Douglas only won 2 states, Missouri and Delaware. The rest of this, and actually it was part of New Jersey. He didn't even win all of New Jersey. The rest of the North went to Abraham Lincoln. John Breckinridge took most of the South. And then a third-party candidate, John Bell, won Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia. When you see multiple candidates divide up the electorate, you often see crazy things happen in the election. And so in 1860, Abraham Lincoln became president of the United States. And the only reason Lincoln became president of the United States is because the very populated northern states, where the Industrial Revolution had huge cities with all sorts of diversity. Abraham Lincoln won all of those states. And Lincoln became president of the United States without carrying a single southern state. In fact, back in those days when you voted, you didn't just walk into the voting booth and pick which candidate you liked. You had to vote with your political party. In most southern states, they did not recognize the newly formed Republican Party. And what that means is, even if you were a Southerner, a rare Southerner who liked Abraham Lincoln and wanted to vote for him, you couldn't have voted for him in the South even if you wanted to, because most southern states did not recognize the new Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln became president of the United States without winning a single southern state, and he wasn't even on the ballot in most of those states. And when Lincoln became president, for most Southerners, that was the final straw. If this man can get elected president of the United States without even being on the ballot down here, Southerners said, well, then there's no point in us being part of the United States. And so before Lincoln even was sworn in, the first Southern states were already seceding, led by South Carolina.